Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the Spanish-American War, and today we are talking about the progressives. So if you are ready, let's begin. Let's think about this. What is the progressive era? So the last era that we talked about in this class was the Gilded Age, right? And that was the 1880-ish to 1900-ish. And that's when big businesses are kind of running everything, right? And workers don't have a lot of rights, and the government is really siding with businesses and gilded, right? Everything kind of looks good on the outside, but there's a lot of problems inside of America. So the progressive era is going to come in response to that, into response to the problems from the Gilded Age. And if you look at the word progressive, progress is that root word, right? And so the progressive era is all about trying to make progress for different groups of people in different parts of society. So it takes place around 1900 to 1920. And why is it happening? Well, like we said, there are those problems in the Gilded Age: political corruption, economic instability, and social concerns. So people are trying to make changes. And how are they going to try to fix these issues? The main way they're going to do this is through increased government action. So start that. Make sure you know it. The progressives want the government to have more of a role in society. Okay. And they want to expand democracy. They think that if more people are allowed to vote, then the people in charge in the government will have to listen to the will of the people. Makes sense. So who makes up the progressives? Okay. Mostly it's middle and upper class people, but it's especially women. And make sure we know women are going to have a really large role in the progressive era. Okay. So make sure we understand that. And in general, just so you know, progressives are going to try to reforms first at the state and local level, and then take those reforms to the national level. So how do progressives get the word out? And one key way they do this is through journalism. Okay. And this is a really important thing to know about how progressives use the news and media to get out and let people know about the problems in society. And the thought is that if people are aware, then they're going to want to do more to solve these problems. So it's really necessary to understand that journalists are a key factor here. Okay. So journalists are usually going to criticize issues at the time. So how are they going to criticize political corruption? Well, one book to know of is Lincoln Steffens' The Shame of Cities. And he kind of talks again about all the problems that are going on in cities related to things like urban machines. All right. How are progressive journalists, and some examples of how they're going to criticize social and economic inequality? Well, we've talked about one of these books before, but it's still very important. Jacob Riis, make sure we know that name, in his book, How the Other Half Lives. It's kind of like a photo book all about how poor immigrants and the lower classes are living in America. And then Ida B. Wells Barnett is a strong advocate, a strong journalist that advocates for the end of lynching, which is kind of like mob violence and mob justice. And often it was targeted against African Americans at the time unfairly. Okay. And lastly, how are progressive journalists going to criticize unregulated businesses? And we'll see this through a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And this is a book all about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And the meatpacking industry is basically the area in Chicago where they would take meat and like make it into sausage and hamburger and all this kind of stuff. And he writes in The Jungle, and he exposes the awful conditions that are going on in the meatpacking industry. You know, there's stories in the book about how there are rats running rampant in these meat factories. Okay, these meatpacking factories. And to catch the rats, they put out poisoned bread. And then when the rats die, they just throw the rats and the bread all into the same hopper, all into the same machine that makes the sausage with the meat, right? So people are eating all this nasty food, and it causes the government to need to get involved because people get so upset by it, because there's at this time, right? There's no FDA, there's no USDA, there's nothing to regulate what is going in people's foods. Okay, so journalism gets the word out, and then people are going to try to start reforms because of journalism. So who are some key reformers to know about? And I would make sure the first two we really understand. I mean, they're all important. You're definitely going to want to be able to name a few of these. Okay, so Robert La Follette, he is the governor of Wisconsin. Okay, and he's a really important progressive to know about, because in the state level, he initiates a lot of things like the direct primary. That's what we have today, where you vote for who's going to be the president or who's going to represent the Democratic Party or the Republican Party before you even vote for the actual president, if that makes sense. So he introduces the direct primary in Wisconsin politics. And he brings in things like initiatives, referendums, and recalls. And all of these are examples of how voters can have more role in the government. Like a recall is where if you don't like a governor, the state voters can vote to oust them and to have another election. That's called a recall election. Or an initiative is where the residents of Wisconsin could vote on a law itself. And this is how a lot of progressive laws are going to get passed, is because the voters get to vote on the law, which sometimes happens a little bit quicker than the people in government. For example, a connection to today, this is how a lot of states pass things like gay marriage or legalization of marijuana, which were some areas that the government maybe wasn't ready to pass, but in certain states, they passed it before the entire government was able to do so. Another important progressive reformer, one of the most important, we've talked about her before, is Jane Addams. Jane Addams is the founder of Hull House, which is a tenement house that comes to support women, children, and immigrants. Make sure we know her and how she is able to support those people in need. Florence Kelly, pictured here on the right, an advocate for the increased rights of women, children, and African Americans. She found something called the National Consumer League, which leads to a lot of boycotts of goods that were made by children in factories. So she's someone who's trying to work again for making sure that child labor comes to an end. And last is a man named W.E.B. Du Bois, who is an African American leader who wants to get an immediate end to segregation. Remember, at this time, there is a lot of issues with Black and white segregation, especially in the South, and W. Du Bois wants an immediate end to that. And this is going to actually help form the NAACP. But one thing to note is that he's not successful here. So W. Du Bois is not able to rally enough people to end segregation. Segregation does not end to the 1960s. So this is often seen as one of the failures of the progressive movement, in a way that the progressives don't adequately give African Americans their equal rights under the law. Okay, so let's shift gears to talking about the progressive presidents. And there's 3 presidents we're really going to talk about. Okay, so in general, the progressive idea for the presidents is that the government needs to get more involved. They need to regulate the economy. No more laissez-faire. And Teddy Roosevelt, one of my favorite presidents, maybe I'll say my favorite president, okay? He comes up with this idea called the Square Deal, and he is the first really progressive president. And the Square Deal is all about controlling corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving natural resources. Okay, so there are things like the Meat Inspection Act that he passes, where that's directly related to The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, where now meat needs to be inspected before it can be sold. Okay, he helps regulate corporations through laws like the Northern Securities Decision, which was a Supreme Court decision, and the Hepburn Act. And the Hepburn Act increases the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which again is all used to regulate big businesses and make it so big businesses cannot get overly large and create monopolies, okay, or trusts. And also, Teddy Roosevelt is a big proponent of the environment, and he spends a lot of time in the environment. There's really cool stories about him, like hiking in the woods with John Muir, another figure we'll talk about later. But he wants to conserve a lot of natural resources, wants to save them, make sure we're not using up all of America's natural resources. So that's Teddy Roosevelt and kind of what he does. Now let's go to the other 2 presidents that are progressives. William Howard Taft is the president after Theodore Roosevelt, and he is often thought of as the real trust buster, meaning he is the one who tries to get big monopoly businesses to be broken apart by the Supreme Court or by laws. Okay, so he wants to make it so that big businesses don't own the entire industry. And he was actually Teddy Roosevelt's one of his best friends, and they worked a lot together. And when Teddy Roosevelt was done being president in 1908. William Howard Taft runs for president, wins, and then in 1912, those 2 gentlemen actually had a falling out, and they actually run against each other. So it's a Republican versus a Republican. Teddy Roosevelt runs under something called the Bull Moose Party, but he's really a Republican. And they run up against this guy, Woodrow Wilson, who is the next person on this list. And because we've seen this, we have third party, we have 2 people of the Republican ideology. The Democrat is going to win, and that's Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is still considered a progressive in many ways. he comes up with this idea called the New Freedom. This is Wilson's New Freedom, right? And so he wants to lower tariffs so that it's easier for the common person to pay for goods, makes it harder for businesses to make money, but easier for common people. He wants to eliminate trusts, so he makes it so there's no distinction between like a good trust and a bad trust. And again, a trust is a company that owns many different companies, and so there's a law that's passed called the Clayton Antitrust Act, and so it's good to know one or two of these laws to see how the progressive presidents limited the power of businesses. He reforms the banking system, and he does this through passing something called the Federal Reserve Act, which we still use today. We have the Federal Reserve, and that's you can kind of think about it like the Bank of the United States if you think back to Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s. So this is a regulatory system in America that kind of controls the money supply in the United States. That's the Federal Reserve. All right. So now let's talk about some constitutional amendments that get put into place in the progressive era. And it's really, first of all, I want to note one thing. We just got the numbers here. You're going to need to write down and listen and write down what these amendments do. It's going to be important. But it's also really important to know that all of these amendments are related to the populist movement. And we talked about that in a previous lesson, how the populists would come back and their ideas, maybe they didn't win. William Jennings Bryan never became president, right? But their ideas come into play through constitutional amendments in the early 1900s. And a constitutional amendment is a change to the actual Constitution. It is an extremely strong law. I believe it takes 2/3 of the states to pass. So it is something that is overwhelmingly the majority of Americans are going to support these ideas. So 16th Amendment, that's the graduated income tax. That means that people who make more money have to pay more money in taxes, and that taxes are going to help the government have more money so that they can solve more of people's problems. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. So that's where now people get to vote on their senators. Before, the House of Representatives elected the senators for their state. So more power to the people. The 18th Amendment, that bans the use of alcohol. That's seen as a progressive idea because alcohol is blamed for a lot of the ills of America and industrialization and domestic abuse. And so when they ban alcohol, that's a strong movement, often led by women, to try to create a more peaceful life. And then lastly, one of the most important here, the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. And that is women's right to vote. And that comes into play in 1919, 1920. And women now finally in the United States have equal political status. We're still going to continue to talk about women's rights as women's rights grow in the social, cultural, economic realm. But now politically, we finally get to equal voting rights. So really important to know these amendments. I would at least have one of these memorized so that you are able to show how the progressives get their ideas into law. Last idea here is environmental, conservation and preservation. And these are two different ideas about the use of resources, okay? And conservationists and preservationists are like two sides of the same coin. They want the United States to care more about the environment. In the late 1800s, the Gilded Age, the Industrial Revolution, America is using its resources to rapidly grow. But as they do that, as they burn coal, as they burn oil, right, it is creating pollution, and they are stripping the land of its resources, often deforesting whole areas, clear cut forestry or mining, the majority of an area. All right. So there is some distinction between these two terms, but they're, again, both environmentalists. Conservationists are people who advocate for the proper use of nature and its resources. So they still want to use nature, they still want to use resources, but they're not going to say that we shouldn't use them at all. They're basically like, if you think about a forest, maybe cut one part of it down one year, replant the trees, cut another part of it down another year, continue like that. Your best example of a conservationist is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. And then the last idea here is preservation, and this is the protection of nature and land from humans entirely. So you can think about a good example for this is like the national park system, which comes into play under Teddy Roosevelt, I believe. And this is where America sets off areas of land that are essentially going to be untouched by American businesses. And it's for Americans to enjoy and to appreciate. And Teddy Roosevelt this idea gets spurred by this guy pictured on the right, this really cool individual, John Muir. And John Muir founds this club called the Sierra Club, which advocates, again, for the idea, like, let's set apart areas of land so that people can enjoy and appreciate nature and it's not going to get ruined. So these are national parks like Yosemite, Yellowstone, that kind of thing, Acadia in Maine, okay? All right, so that is it for our notes today on the progressives. Let's make sure we understand our big ideas. Make sure we're writing these down. Okay, so number one, describe the goals of the progressives. What are all their general goals? And let's get specific about one and how they accomplish one of them. Number two, describe the effects of the progressive movement. And again, let's be specific about one effect. Name it. Make sure you can name a law, something like that, okay? And third, describe the conservation and preservation movement. Maybe get some people and some ideas to give examples for those. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.